Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from RAU'S IAS Study Cell.
Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Indian newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the daily edition of the Indian newspaper dated 12th October 2022. And the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. So let us start the discussion.
This article on page number 7 is related to the recent survey that was conducted by the Reserve Bank of India related to consumer confidence in Indian economy. Now in this line, such consumer surveys are conducted by the Reserve Bank of India in a bi-monthly manner. And this highlights the optimism of the consumers in the Indian economy. And that impacts their consumer expenditure, which is very crucial for India's economic growth. And that is why in this article, we are going to understand what is the importance of consumer confidence in the Indian economy and how would it impact the India's GDP growth rate. And after that, we'll look at this survey that is conducted by the RBI, that is the Consumer Confidence Survey, and what exactly are the learnings from the September 2022's Consumer Confidence Survey. So let us look at all these aspects one by one. Some of the points which can be important for us from prelims examination perspective, and some points can be important for us and we can use that in overall answers related to economy, related to India's growth story in the mains examination. Now, if we talk about the consumer expenditure, now, consumer expenditure is basically related to spending that is done by consumers in the Indian economy. And this spending by the consumers is crucial because it will lead to increase in demand of goods and services in the Indian economy. And if the demand for goods and services increases in the Indian economy, and if it leads to increased production, that will lead to increase in the GDP growth rate. And that is why this consumer expenditure is very crucial for India's growth story. In this line, if you try to understand the importance of the consumer expenditure and the confidence that the Indian consumer has in the Indian economy or the Indian growth rate, the consumer expenditure accounts for almost 60% of India's GDP. This highlights the crucial share or the crucial role that consumer expenditure has in India's GDP. And if this consumer expenditure is more, it will lead to increased GDP growth rate. And if it is less, it will lead to impacted or decreased GDP growth rate. Now, this consumer expenditure is not constant at all the time. This keeps on fluctuating. That is, it increases at some point of time, it decreases at some point of time. Now, normally, if you look at the consumer expenditure in a year, it normally increases when the festivals are going on. For example, the consumer expenditure is high around Diwali or let's say other important festivals. However, the most crucial factor that impacts the consumer expenditure is the confidence that the Indian consumer has in the India's future growth story. So let's say if there are projections that the GDP growth rate is going to be high in the coming year or the coming few months, then that will lead to increased confidence of the consumers in the Indian economy, because it will also make them understand that they are going to earn more in the coming times because the economic future looks bright, and accordingly they will also spend more, and that is why the consumer expenditure will increase. So this simply means that if the consumer optimism is more in the Indian economy, if the growth potential of the economy is high, if the projections of economic growth rate are high, then the consumers would have more optimism in the Indian economy, and that would lead to increased spending. Further, if the consumers are not very optimistic about the economy, let's say because of the global geopolitical crisis that we are witnessing, because of the Ukraine war, the fuel crisis that we are witnessing across the globe, or maybe because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the consumers would not be very optimistic about the economic growth rate. And that is why they would spend less. And this consumer confidence has impact on the Indian GDP growth rate. And that is why this is very crucial, and that is why the RBI conducts a survey to understand the consumer confidence in the Indian economy. So in this case, if the consumers are optimistic about the economy, they would spend more and it would lead to increased GDP growth rate. However, if they are not very optimistic in the economy, they would spend less and this might lead to decreased GDP growth rate. So that is how the consumer confidence impacts the consumer expenditure, which in turn impacts the GDP growth rate. In this context, let us try and understand the key aspects of the consumer confidence survey that is conducted by the Reserve Bank of India. So if you look at the consumer confidence survey, it is conducted by the Reserve Bank of India, and this can become a very important fact for us from the prelims examination perspective. Secondly, it is conducted in 19 major cities of India, which means that it is not conducted across the all Indian cities. This is also one important aspect that we need to understand. Further, this survey measures the consumer perception, both current level of perception and the optimism that the consumers have in the future growth story on the basis of 5 economic variables. What are these economic variables? First is the prevailing economic situation. If the inflation is very high or not, if the GDP growth rate is high or not, is there any important event that is impacting economic growth story? All these are measured through the economic situation. Second is the employment level. Third is the price level or the inflation in the Indian economy. Fourth is income as well as spending. So fourth is this and fifth is spending. So these are the 5 variables which are used by the RBI to conduct the consumer confidence survey. In this consumer confidence survey, the RBI carries out 2 main indices. First is the current situation index and the second is the future expectation index. That is, what is the current level of optimism that the consumers have in the economy and what is their confidence in the future of the Indian economy. So what the current situation index does is that it measures the change in the consumer perception over an economic issue in the last 1 year. However, the future expectation index measures what the consumers think about the same variables 1 year ahead. And if a consumer confidence index is above 100, it gives optimistic perception of the consumers, while if the reading is below 100, it denotes a pessimistic perception. So in this line, let us look at what exactly are the outcomes of the recent survey that was conducted by the Reserve Bank of India in September 2022. So if you look at the consumer confidence survey that was conducted, the current situation index lies in the pessimistic zone, which is highlighted by this red line because it is below 100. And although the future perception is a bit on higher side because the COVID has already vanished, it is still low. So in this line, the 2 important highlights of this survey are that the consumer confidence has been on a recovery path since July 2021 after the impact of COVID-19 pandemic waned. However, the current situation index continues to remain in negative territory. That is, it is still in the negative territory, which is a cause of concern for the consumer expenditure optimism or the consumer confidence that the consumers have in Indian economy. These are the 2 important learnings from the consumer confidence survey of the Reserve Bank of India. With this, let's take up the next news article now. This article on page number 1 is related to the pending RTI pleas across information commissions in India. And that is why the issues in the functioning of the Right to Information Act is a very important issue for us from General Studies paper 2 point of view. Now we note that it is one of the important tools for empowering the citizens against the government, and it aims at holding the government accountable by making the information available to the citizenry. However, over a period of time, concerns have been raised regarding the weakening of the RTI Act by various amendments and its way of functioning. So in this regard, in this article, we will mainly focus on the 2019 amendments to the Right to Information Act and how it has weakened the RTI Act. Also, we'll look at some of the general issues that are faced in the functioning of the Right to Information Act and the functioning of the information commissions. And they can be used in answering questions in the General Studies paper 2 in the governance part. Also, they can be used in writing answers in the ethics paper in the General Studies paper 4. Now, the 2019 amendment has changed the tenure of the Chief Information Commissioner and the State Information Commissioners and has also changed the terms of service of these offices. Now, the original act had set the term of the Central Chief Information Commissioner and the Information Commissioners at 5 years or until the age of 65, whichever is earlier. However, this amendment has removed the tenure of 5 years and has replaced it with the term for such term as may be prescribed by the central government. Further, the original act provided that the salaries and allowances and other terms of the service of the Chief Information Commissioner shall be same as that of the Chief Election Commissioner, and those of an Information Commissioner shall be the same as that of Election Commissioner. However, the 2019 amendment has said that the salaries, allowances and other terms of services of the Chief Information Commissioner and the Information Commissioners shall be such as may be prescribed by the central government. So the fixed tenure and the service conditions that were provided in the original act have now been done away with the amendment of 2019. And in this regard, the central government has been provided with the power of prescribing the term of the Central Information Commissioners and also the service conditions. Further, regarding the State Information Commissioners, the original act provided that the tenure of service will be 5 years or 65 years of age, whichever is earlier. And regarding the salaries, allowance and other terms of services, the Chief Information Commissioner of the state was to be considered as similar to the Election Commissioner, and the salaries and other terms of services of the state information commissioners were to be same as the chief secretary to the state government. However, in this again, the 2019 amendment has made the changes that the salaries, allowances, and other terms of services shall be such as may be prescribed by the central government. And also, the central government will control through the rules, the terms, and the conditions of appointment of commissioners in the state governments. Now, we note that security of tenure is one of the important factors for ensuring the independence of an institution. And we note that such security of tenure has been provided to the CAG or the Comptroller and Auditor General and other constitutional bodies as well. However, by removing the security of tenure and placing it in the hands of the central government, the independence of the institution of the right to information is at stake. Further, the independence of the institution is again at stake because if the information commissioners provide a decision which goes against the government, they can be removed at will by the government because of these new amendments. So this means that the amendments of 2019 will severely impact the independence of the institution of right to information and the information commissioners. So this is one of the important amendment that has weakened the institution of Right to Information Act. Now, besides the weakening of the institution of RTI by the amendments of 2019, another concern has been the lack of appointment or timely appointment of the information commissioners. And in this regard, the governments have failed to appoint the information commissioners on time, and this has led to increased pendency of the RTI cases. Further, in various state commissions, it has been observed that they are functioning at reduced capacity with less number of information commissioners. And as such, it impacts the speedy disposal of the RTI cases. Further, majority of the times, pleas have been made in the Supreme Court for the appointment of the commissioners in the Central Information Commission. Now, despite the Supreme Court orders to fill all the vacancies, 6 out of the 11 posts of commissioners in the Central Information Commission are currently vacant. So you can see that the government has failed to appoint the commissioners in the Central Information Commission in a timely manner. And this has adversely impacted the speedy disposal of the RTI cases, and as such, there has been huge pendency in the RTI cases. Now, besides the weakening of the RTI institution by the 2019 amendment and lack of timely appointment of the commissioners, the other challenges include the low awareness levels among the people and especially among the marginalized sections about the rules and process of the RTI application. Further, there are non-uniform RTI rules and procedures across the states. Also, there is no uniformity in the fee structure across the states, and there has been unsupportive attitudes of the public information officers. Further, RTI activists have been intimidated and have been threatened by people who are in power. Also, there has been ineffective record management system in the state field offices or the departments. And there has also been lack of inadequate training to the public information officers, etc. And last but not the least, there has been increased workloads on the PIOs due to understaffed positions of the public information officers. So we have seen that these are some of the challenges in the functioning of the Right to Information Act. And some of the benefits of the RTI Act you might have studied in the static portion of the syllabus have also been provided in the PDF of today's discussion. So do go through them and try and understand the RTI Act in a holistic manner. With this, let's take up the next article now. Again, this article on page number 1 reads that the International Monetary Fund has cut India's growth forecast to 6.8% this year. Now, the International Monetary Fund has reduced the India's growth forecast because of various external factors like the Ukraine war and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. And the IMF has highlighted all these aspects in one of its very important report, which is known as the World Economic Outlook Report, which is published by the International Monetary Fund. Now, if you look at the previous year question papers, UPSC has been asking questions related to important indices or reports and the body which publishes or calculates these indices or publishes these reports. For example, in the year 2016, a question was asked that the Global Financial Stability Report is prepared by which of the following? So the correct answer here was International Monetary Fund. Similarly, UPSC has asked questions related to important reports published by World Economic Forum, reports published by World Bank, etc. And that is why we should know from this article that the World Economic Outlook is published by International Monetary Fund, which can be a very important aspect for us from the prelims examination perspective. Now, in this regard, although the things that are mentioned in this article are not very important for us from the exam perspective, however, there is another important issue associated with the International Monetary Fund, and that is related to the quotas in the International Monetary Fund and how the IMF raises funds for itself. And we have already covered that in a previous DNS video. So we will be revising from that previous DNS video the various aspects of the IMF funding as well as the quotas that are decided or provided to different countries at the IMF. And what are the issues that are being faced in this regard. Let us revise all these aspects related to IMF, which can be very important for us from the mains examination perspective also. Now, to understand the ongoing issue regarding the quota changes in IMF, let us first understand how does the IMF raise its funds. So there are three ways in which the IMF raises its funds. First is that it raises funds through the quota that is given to the member countries. So for example, India has a quota of about 2.76%. However, as compared to India, the United States of America has the highest quota, and that stands at about 17.46%. Now, according to one's quota, the country has to contribute to the IMF funds. And as the United States of America provides the highest amount of funding to the International Monetary Fund, it has the highest quota in IMF. The second way in which the IMF raises its funds is through New Arrangement for Borrowing or NAB. Now, under this new arrangement for borrowing, different member countries and institutions lend to the IMF. And this constitutes the second layer of funding to the IMF. And the third one is the bilateral borrowing agreements. And under this, the IMF gets into an agreement with a country, and through that, it borrows money from that country. Now, the issue with these two fundings, that is the new arrangement for borrowing and the bilateral borrowing agreements, is that it does not change the quota of the member countries. And that is why presently the IMF is relying on sourcing its funds through these two arrangements, and it is not changing its quota for different countries. And as the IMF is not ready to change the quota for different countries, the developing countries like India and China are resenting to it. And that is mainly because now India and China have emerged as few of the important economic players in the world economy. However, their voting rights and quota in the IMF remains unchanged, and it is very low as compared to the other developed countries. So due to the changing economic scenario around the world, the developing countries are demanding a change in the quota system, which also has an impact on the voting rights for these countries in the overall decision making of the IMF. So in this background, let us understand few facts regarding the International Monetary and Finance Committee, that is IMFC. Also, what is this quota system and how does the quota review system works, or how can this quota be changed. Further, we will learn about the special drawing rights in which this quota is provided to the countries. And also we'll look in detail about these three sources of funding for the IMF and what is the recent decision of this IMFC or International Monetary and Finance Committee, and what are the issues with that. Now, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created at a famous conference known as the Bretton Woods Conference, which was held in the year 1944. And this conference was held after the Second World War in order to ensure global financial stability and to promote growth and economic development. So in this regard, the role of World Bank is limited to give loans to the poor and developing countries to promote growth and development. However, the IMF's main role is to give loans to the member countries which are facing the problem of balance of payments. And you should note that in the year 1992, when India was facing a severe balance of payment crisis, it resorted to loans from the International Monetary Fund. And that is why India embraced the reforms of liberalization, privatization and globalization. Now, this International Monetary and Finance Committee has decided to increase the non-permanent sources of the IMF funds. And we note that these non-permanent sources are the new arrangements for borrowing, NAB, or the bilateral borrowing arrangements. So in this regard, let us first understand what is this IMFC and what is its key role. Now, as far as the highest decision-making body of the IMF is concerned, it is the Board of Governors. And it consists of one governor and also one alternate governor for each member country. And this governor is appointed by a member country and is usually the Minister of Finance or the head of the central bank. Now, what this IMFC or International Monetary and Finance Committee does is that it advises and reports to the IMF Board of Governors on the supervision and management of the international monetary and financial system. So, this mainly reports and advises the IMF's Board of Governors. So, it is an advisory body. Further, IMFC has 24 members who are drawn from the pool of 189 governors, which are appointed by different member countries. Now, this IMFC meets twice a year and discusses matters of common concern which affect the global economy. And it also advises the IMF on the direction of its work. So, in this background, let us understand what is this quota system. So, this quota simply determines the maximum amount of financial resource that a member is obliged to provide to the IMF. So, according to the quota which has been provided to different countries, these countries will have to provide the funding to the IMF. And this financial contribution of each member country or the quota is based on four important indicators. First is the size of GDP. Secondly, the openness in its economy. Third is the economic variability and its international forex reserves. Now, initially, when the IMF was created, the developed countries had the highest amount of quota. However, now other developing countries are also catching up. For example, India and China have the highest growing economies in the world. And their size of GDP has now increased considerably and they fall in the top 10 important economies of the world. However, their quota in the IMF has not increased up to that extent. And that is a contentious issue, and these developing countries are now demanding an increased quota in the IMF and have suggested that the quota system should now be reviewed once again. Now, these quotas are dominated in the special drawing rights, and these are the IMF's unit of accounting. Now, these SDRs are based on a basket of important international currencies, and we will look at these special drawing rights in the later half of this video. Now, what is the importance of this quota system for different countries? So, importance is that it determines the voting power of a country in the IMF's decision making, and also it determines the borrowing limits for that country. And this borrowing limit determines the amount of money or loan which a member country can avail from the IMF. So, regarding voting power, the quota also determines the voting power of the member countries, and the borrowing limit determines the amount of loans which a member country can avail from the IMF. And that is why the developing countries now want an increased quota in the IMF so that their decision making power in the IMF increases and also their borrowing limits increase. Now, this quota system in the IMF is reviewed regularly, and usually this period is about 5 years. So let us look at how does this quota review system works at the IMF. Now, the Board of Governors of the IMF reviews this quota system in the IMF. And any change in this quota has to be approved by about 85% majority of the total votes in the IMF. Further, an important clause is that a member's quota cannot be changed without its consent. So, the consent of the country whose quota is being changed is also important. Now, recently, the 14th quota review was held in the year 2010. And this led to the changes in the quota for different countries at the IMF. And in this, the quota for developing countries was increased because of their increasing share in the global economy. And accordingly, India's quota and voting rights increased. So, as far as India's quota and voting rights are concerned, India's quota stands at about 2.76%. And its voting right stands at about 2.64%. However, USA has the highest quota and voting rights, and its quota stands at about 17.46%, and it has voting rights of about 16.52%. So in this regard, you should also note the top 10 countries which have the highest quota and voting rights at the IMF. So the first is USA, second is Japan, third is China, then there is Germany, France, UK, Italy, and then there is India. And India stands at 8th rank in terms of its quota and voting power. And India is followed by Russia and Brazil. So this is the sequence of top 10 countries which have the highest quota at the IMF. Now, as we have learned that the quota in the IMF is dominated in the SDRs or the special drawing rights. So let us understand what is meant by this special drawing rights. So simply you should note that it is IMF's unit of accounting, and it is an international reserve asset which was created by IMF in the year 1969. And it is meant to supplement the member countries' official foreign exchange reserves. And these SDRs are allocated to the member countries in proportion to their IMF quotas. Now here it is important to note that SDRs do not represent any currency and they cannot be used for transactions. However, the value of SDR is decided on the basis of a basket of 5 currencies, and these include the US dollar, the euro, the Chinese renminbi, Japanese yen, and the British pound and sterling. And if you note that in the year 2016, when the fifth currency, that is Chinese renminbi, was added, it was asked in the preliminary examination of 2016, and the question read, which of the following currencies has been recently added to the SDR basket? So that is why it is important for you to remember the 5 currencies in the SDR basket. Now here it is important to note that SDR cannot be used for conventional transactions. However, if a country has SDRs with it, it can exchange it for other foreign countries. This is because its value is based on 5 different currencies. Now as this SDR cannot be used for settling transactions, however, it can be used for obtaining foreign currencies. It is also known as paper gold. So as we have learned initially that IMF raises its funds through 3 important sources. The first is the quota system, and under this the financial contribution is made by the member countries according to the quota which has been assigned to these countries. And the basis for assigning the quota has also been learned in a previous slide. The second source of funding is the new arrangements for borrowing, and through this new arrangements for borrowing, a number of member countries and institutions lend their additional resources to IMF beyond their quota. And this stands as a second line of defense to supplement the IMF resources. However, by contributing through this new arrangement to borrow, the quota of the member countries does not change. And the third one is the third line of defense after the quotas and the new arrangement for borrowing is the bilateral borrowing agreements. And under this, the IMF has entered into several rounds of bilateral borrowing agreements with certain member countries to ensure that it could meet the financing needs of its members. And presently, the lending capacity of IMF stands at $1 trillion. So after all these basics, let us understand what is the recent decision of the IMFC. Now presently, the 15th review of the IMF's quota was scheduled in the year 2019. However, during a recent meeting of the IMFC or International Monetary and Finance Committee, it has been decided to maintain the total lending capacity of IMF at about $1 trillion only. And this would be done without enhancing the quota for different member countries. However, the IMF will increase its funding through the new arrangements to borrow and through bilateral borrowing agreements. And according to this decision, the 15th review has now been extended till 2020. Now in this background, India and other developing countries are demanding an increase in their quota and voting shares at the IMF. However, the developed countries like USA and others are opposing this increase in the voting rights for developing countries like India and China. Further, this change in quota is becoming difficult because the quota can only be increased if 85% of the member countries agree to it. And since USA enjoys about 15% of the voting rights at IMF, it can exercise a virtual veto on the decisions of the IMF. And we know that the US has been opposing the changes in the quota system, and they are also opposing the changes in the quota for developing countries. And that is why this has become a contentious issue at the 15th review of the quota system. So this was the issue, and some of the points that we have discussed regarding the quota system, SDRs, etc. becomes important for the preliminary examination point of view. With this, let's take up the next article. This article on page number 10 is related to a new change that has been done in one of the important flagship scheme of the government of India, and that is the Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao Andolan. In this line, a new change has been done, that is non-traditional livelihood skilling of the girls will be included in the Beti Padhao scheme. In this regard, let us look at a few points which are important for us from the prelims examination perspective related to the Beti Padhao scheme. Now, the new changes that have been done related to the Beti Padhao scheme is that it will now include skilling of the girls in non-traditional livelihood options. In this line, it will focus on increasing the enrollment of girls in secondary education, particularly in the science stream, that is science, technology, engineering as well as mathematics. In this regard, a memorandum of understanding has been signed between the three ministries, which include Ministry of Women and Child Development, Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, as well as Minority Affairs. And if you look at the basics of the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao Andolan, it was first launched by the Prime Minister of India on January 22nd, 2015 at Panipat in Haryana. Now, this addresses the declining child sex ratio and related issues of women empowerment over a life cycle continuum. It is basically a tri-ministerial effort of Ministry of Women and Child Development, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare as well as Ministry of Education. And the overall long-term objective of the Beti Bachao Beti Padhao scheme is to improve the child sex ratio in the country and create an enabling environment for the all-round development of the girl child. And it includes a very important campaign of celebrating the girl child and enabling their education. This article on page number 13 is related to a historic agreement that has been reached between Israel and Lebanon related to maritime border. In this line, Israel and Lebanon have been adversaries in the West Asia, and we are aware that the geopolitics of West Asia has been changing in the recent past because of the Abraham Accords, which have been finalized by the mediation of the United States of America, which is normalizing ties between Israel and some of the Arabic countries. And in this context, the Israel-Lebanon agreement is a historic one. In this regard, if you try to understand the geopolitics of West Asia, you can go through the DNS of 18 July 2022, where we have discussed in detail the different aspects of the geopolitics of West Asia. In this regard, in this particular article, the important thing for us to know is the maritime border dispute related to gas fields between Israel and Lebanon. Now, if you look at the maritime border dispute between Israel and Lebanon, it was regarding the maritime border in the Mediterranean Sea, and it was related to the exploitation of natural gas from this particular area, which is disputed between Lebanon and Israel. In this regard, you should also be aware of the locations of the Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria here. And by looking at this map, it is very clear that Jordan does not share a border with the Mediterranean Sea, which has been asked by UPSC in at least 2 years in the previous years. And this decision related to maritime border dispute is related to two of the important prospective gas fields, which are the Karish gas field and the Kana prospect or the Kana gas field. In this regard, the agreement says that the Karish gas field would fall under Israeli control along with a small part of the Kana. And the rest of the Kana would be under the Lebanon's control, and it would pay royalties to Israel for any gas that is extracted from the Israeli side. So all these points that we have seen here are important for us from the prelims examination perspective.